Okay, so good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to our informational session. This meeting was originally designed with the intent of being a special city council meeting. However, due to conflicts, we weren't able to establish a quorum. So instead, we've asked our elected officials not to participate, and this actually gives us the opportunity to provide you an informational session as we start off our budget process. So tonight, the focus is going to be really on revenues, some early estimates, and big new asks from departments, and then a little bit of a highlight on some special events. And to help us with this presentation tonight, we're actually going to have our interim finance director, Jacob Henderson, start off with giving us some analysis of this current year's revenue status. And then eventually he's going to go into some predictions for next year based on very early estimates. This is pretty early in the financial year for us to be making estimates about potential revenues for 2027. So we do ask that everybody take these with a grain of salt. We're doing the best that we can with the data we have available, and we're going to continue to refine these numbers as we continue through the budget process. Jacob, would you be so kind as to start the process?
Yeah, so our current year projections here for the general fund. If we look at it here, we're above budget, $1.6 million. Compared to last year, we're up about $1 million or 4.38%. One key note here is that our building permits and our engineering fees, we have a pretty substantial increase there due to three major developments. As you can see here, we're estimating about $1.3 million above budget here. We have substantial increases in our permits and licensing, and also our all other category. A couple things to note here: our other taxes consist of telecommunications tax, cannabis tax, franchise fees, etc. As you can see in these pie graphs here, we're about on track with our budget percentage-wise. You can see the big jump there with the permits and licensing and registrations. And then here for a 10-year sales tax trend. We have a slight dip there between fiscal year 25 and 26 due to the loss of grocery tax. Our income tax continues to rise. This year we're estimating to increase about 7.2%. And our short-term interest rates continue to decline, and we expect them to decline throughout 2026 and early 2027. What these are our interest on our investments, as well as our interest on our debt. So back to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Jacob. So as we're kind of looking through this, the next step is going to be talking about next year's economic context, trends and external influences. And a lot of this information we end up pulling from the IML, also known as the Illinois Municipal League. So unemployment, which impacts consumer spending and local taxes, in 2026, we're looking at about 4.5%. And in 2027, the estimates are going to be pretty similar of around 4.3 to 4.4%. Consumer spending, which affects sales tax projections, in 2026, we started to experience some slowing of growth to about 1.4 to 2.1%. And 2027, they're estimating similar slow growth. The GDP is expecting some more modest revenue growth. In 2026, we're looking at 1.6 to 2.2%. And in 2027, the estimates are at 1.7 to 1.8%. Next up, we're going to talk about inflation, which has been a very hot topic for the past several years. It can affect both the city's costs as well as our residents' purchasing power. So in 2026, we were looking at inflation of about 2.7%. And in 2027, it's currently predicted at a lower 2.3%. We do want to caution leaning too heavily on those numbers, though, because any energy-related volatility could have a significant impact, and that would be very difficult for us to predict. So a couple other things covered in the IML economic outlook would be the local government distributive fund, also known as LGDF, and that's income tax distribution. So for 2026 into 2027, it's looking like it's going to be basically flat. and that comes in at about $180 per capita. Cannabis distributions, even though West Chicago doesn't have cannabis dispensaries, we still get a portion of the state cannabis sales distribution. And we've noticed that has started to trend downwards, so it's kind of flat or slightly lower in the coming years. And then we have the state use tax, which does remain below historic levels, but that's largely due to statutory changes in the way that that's allocated, and it is still increasing slightly into the next year. So next, we're going to talk about the general fund fiscal year 2027, and Jacob is going to be so kind as to take a couple slides from me.
First one here is our red light violation camera projections. As you can see, in 2026, we gained one camera back. It's our least productive camera out of the two. However, going forward, we don't know when that second camera is going to come back, so we did budget pretty conservatively for 2027. Here's our full 2027 revenue projections. As you can see, we have a slight decrease from the estimated 2026 value. However, we did increase from 2024 or 2026's budget. The reason that we're not budgeting higher is because, again, we will have that permitting and engineering fees that we cannot count on going forward. It's back to you.
All right. So this next slide is a little bit more complicated, so I want you to stay with me. So we call this general fund base budget preliminary revenue and expense estimate. So we're going to talk through what's on here. That first line in yellow, estimated fiscal year 27 revenue. That's what we've been talking about. That's what Jacob has presented on. He's done some analysis, he's pulled information from IML, and he's estimating, with the information he has available right now, that in fiscal year 27, we're going to bring in approximately $25,695,000 in revenue. The next line is a little bit more complicated. Some of you may have actually joined us back in 2025 when we did our first budget workshop series. And at that time frame, we were preparing our budget for 2026. And that's the main thing that we talked about publicly. But at that time, we also try to project an estimate of our budget for 2027 and 2028. What we're using here, because it's so early in our budget process, is this estimated budget is just based on what in 2025 we estimated our 2027 budget might look like. So you can think of this as kind of a status quo budget. Doesn't include new initiatives, it doesn't include new staffing, it doesn't even account for positions that we may have added within the past few months that may not have been captured when we were doing this analysis all the way back in 2025. But it does give us a nice starting point so we can see kind of where are the estimated revenues aligning with estimated expenditures to help us determine how we want to structure the budgets in the next step. So what we have right now is the estimated revenue for next year is $25,695,500. And the proposed expenses at a status quo level budget, $25,024,223. So in theory, that puts us at revenues above base budget of $671,000 or $671,277. So that's a nice starting point, much better than in 2025, where we actually started off in the red with this exercise. However, there are some challenges with this number. One thing, it provides a very limited buffer for economic downturn or state interference. State interference could look like when they removed the state grocery tax. It can also look like when they create a new mandate or a new responsibility that as a municipality we have to do, and therefore find the funds to accomplish. It also would provide minimal expansion for services or new projects or staffing to accomplish new projects that have already been decided on. Next, this would make it very unlikely that at the end of 2027, we would be in a position to transfer surplus money into our relatively new downtown revitalization fund. And this fund is something that allows us to take some extra investment into our downtown, which is something that the community has said is very important to them. The structure also includes the SURF payments at lower than our 100% recommended amount. It would put them at 75%. CERP is the Capital Equipment Replacement Fund. So this would mean that we're not quite funding our equipment at the rate we need to make sure that we have the money set aside to replace it when replacements become necessary. So while this is a nice starting point, as we align with what our priorities are going to be and determine how we want to invest into the community, we have to make sure that the money that we have allows us to accomplish those goals. So this is going to be a little bit interesting of an approach, but this slide is general fund new request shortfalls. So the way that we go through this exercise is we take those revenues above base budget, that's 670,000, and then we take all the new requests, suggestions from elected officials, all of our departments. We just kind of collect it all together and we try to figure out how much would those new requests cost without us trying to do them more efficiently, without us heavily evaluating if there's some other revenue like a grant that we can grab. We'll take the opportunity that if we know of a specific grant, for example, if we have a grant that's been mostly awarded to us and it's just in the final stages, then we use that to reduce it from what was originally, I think, closer to 7 million. But it's a rough number. It's an estimate to help us start conversations. Even within the items that we include in this, we're estimating them on a high end. So if we have a range of something being between 350,000 to 450,000 for this estimate, we used the 450,000 so that we could have that bigger picture to participate in this exercise. Some of the other things that we did take down is we do know that we have 2.3 million that was recently transferred to our downtown revitalization fund. So we applied that to the new requests. So that's kind of already brought it down from that original 7 million. There's some other things though that we didn't account for yet. So there could be additional grants for us to apply for. We could get money from sale of city property, and there could be other savings by investing in one aspect within these requests. We have a saving elsewhere in our budgets. And then the last thing is just to note that these requests haven't been evaluated on if they align with city council priorities or if they make sense for us at this time. This is really just that starting exercise, and we're bringing you all in so that you can participate with us. So we're going to go start running down some of those requests, starting off with expanded service requests on staffing. So we've heard that there's desire to have some more community policing initiatives, particularly providing support to some of the apartment complexes in town. And if we were to do that, we would need another police officer. And once you account for salary and benefits and other incidentals, you're looking at about $165,000. Also, because we're so engaged with the community and we have so many FOIA requests as part of transparency, we're having a hard time keeping up. We have records clerks now, but the influx of requests have increased something like 40%, right, Colin?
Yeah.
And that's a lot extra to take on. So the police department would prefer a full-time records clerk at 95,000, but they've also provided us some data that a part-time records clerk will cost around $25,000. We also have another opportunity within the police department is that they can participate in an IGA and use some grant funding to have a shared social worker to support 3 communities, and our share of that would be $30,000. At City Hall, we're also looking at some options for potential staffing increases. So our community development department has said that the customer service that they would like to provide, being able to return phone calls, respond to FOIA requests, and streamline processes to make them more efficient for our customers, that they need more assistance to be able to do that. So they requested a part-time person to assist in that department. In administration, we're hearing continued requests for more community engagement and also to support our elected officials in being able to engage with the community more. So we're looking at a possible community engagement person. And in addition, that person could help us with some administrative work and just try to make the work that we're doing more accessible to the public. Next, we have a new business and community relations department that was created in October of 2024. The initial department structure was pretty lean, only a few positions. But as we've started to take advantage of having this department dedicated to these initiatives, we're finding that what the community is wanting and what the elected officials are looking for is hard to accomplish with the staffing that we have now. So here we have a proposal for an assistant director for that department, and that role could take on some of the larger scale projects to free up the department director to focus even more on economic development, as well as some administrative support. Most of our departments do have someone to assist with phone calls, requisitions, invoices, and other administrative tasks. This department, because it's relatively new, wasn't designed with that structure. And then, as we continue through our expanded service requests, we're actually looking at some technology. So many of you may have heard of an ERP, also known as an enterprise resource planning. And the city has an existing ERP, but we have challenges with it. It's outdated. It's difficult for us to pull reports. It doesn't have components that are user-friendly for residents or customers to engage with. It also doesn't interface with other software and other tasks that other departments are doing, which means that we're losing out on inefficiencies. We're having challenges with transparency, and we're not providing the level of customer service we'd like to be in the position to provide. Things that are included in an expanded ERP could also have a utility billing portal, which is something that we've heard a lot of feedback from the community that they would like. Now, when we look at these numbers, I absolutely understand that the 350,000 to 450,000 is a big number. Now, that's going to depend on what ERP we go with, what modules within that ERP we actually select to do, but that's also considered an upfront kind of first year cost. $250,000 of that is considered an implementation cost. So that's setting up that infrastructure. It's moving the data to where it needs to be. It's testing that data to make sure that it's functioning correctly in the ERP. And most importantly, it's training our staff on how to use it most efficiently. So as we're looking at the years going forward, we would be looking at spending an annual cost of around $150,000 for the ERP. Now, I know that sounds like a lot too. However, the things that we would be looking to accomplish with that ERP, some of them are being done to some level with existing software, and that is about $198,000 a year. So we have the opportunity to move away from up to $198,000 of existing expenses, replacing it in future years with $150,000 expenses. And it would be a more useful package, providing better service, better transparency, and would bring us more in line with peer municipalities in the way that we're managing our operations. So here in Public Works, we have a couple of projects that have been on the radar, some of them off and on for a while. So one of them is an elevated water tower. And so several years ago, early 2000s, 2010, there was a study and it found that while we're meeting our daily needs of water use, no problem, if there were multiple structure fires in the community, particularly in some different areas of town, we don't have the stored water level to successfully respond to that and maintain the level of distribution that we would be looking to for a community of our size. To solve that, we would be looking at doing an elevated water tower. So right now, we're talking about the placeholder of $50,000 in 2027 that would allow us to finish up some design schematics and go through a potential IEPA loan process that would hopefully allow us to fund this project with a low or no interest loan. So that's one of the items we have on our radar. Next, we have a consolidated public works facility. So back in 2023, we did a facility space needs assessment, and we found that we have some challenges with the way that Public Works has been set up. While we have the water treatment plant over on Hawthorne Lane that many people are familiar with, we also have locations on Church Street, Blakely, Grand Lake, and we had storage over on Washington Street, which we've recently lost because we're focusing on that area as a redevelopment opportunity. When you start spreading operations out across multiple buildings like that, you end up losing efficiencies. You end up having more space that you have to pay to maintain. And you end up losing out on that land having better uses out into the community. So some of these locations are actually kind of very close to residential property, and it may not be the best long-term use of that site. By doing a consolidated public works facility, we would be going on land that the city already owns that is open over by that Hawthorne Lane water treatment facility. And we'd allow those other spaces to be opened out for development. Next, we talk about the City Museum, which we've been making some important investments in the recent years. The museum is on the National Register of Historic Buildings, and so that's a special part of our community history. And the recent investments have been focusing on things like the masonry and anything else you might want to add on that?
Yeah, it's building improvements. We're swapping out windows and doors on the second floor, and second floor and third floor.
Mhm.
Also a roof replacement and some HVAC.
So a lot of big investments into the structure. What's interesting is we have an unusual timing in that next year we're supposed to be doing the downtown modernization and beautification project. And with that, the entrance of the museum is going to be in a space that's under construction. So if there's a time to go through the process of doing an ADA entrance, that would be the time that we would likely want to go through that process when there's already construction going on. Certain amount of economies of scale and making things a little bit simpler as far as shutting down operations. Similar, because we've had the museum be relocated temporarily because of this upcoming construction project, we could also take advantage of this to do some interior work, such as improvements in the bathrooms. Next, we're looking at the water treatment plant roof replacements. About a year ago, we had a significant storm and resulted in some damage to the roof at the water treatment plant. We're able to make some temporary repairs, but we're now at the point that we really should be looking at ensuring the safety of that structure. And then the next item, this is relocating CIP items to the general fund. In general, there are best practices when you're budgeting as a local government. And that is that the items that are in the CIP are larger scale, not necessarily repeat projects. And then the things that might go out of your general fund or other funding operations are things that are kind of ordinary and everyday, and you're repeating and you're doing it all the time, like patching and painting and streetlights. Those are kind of normal public works functions. For quite a while, West Chicago has had about $150,000 of those things in the CIP fund, but best practice would be to shift them back to the general fund, which is why we're highlighting that option today. Okay, next we're into economic revitalization. So we've talked about the Washington site. In that area, we have somewhere around 15 acres of land owned by the city that's really ripe for development opportunity. And there's a lot of different approaches that we can take on that. We're working on an RFQ right now with a concept plan designer, but there are some opportunities in between that concept plan being ready to execute that we can start talking about now. So one of the things that's come up is the idea of creating a market next to 103 West Washington, which some people may know as the former Grovy's Hardware. So there's a small parking lot there that there's the opportunity to actually build a structure on that would allow us to have a space that we could have markets year round, could also be rented as a potential community event space. And this idea was pitched to Congresswoman Delia Ramirez, and we're in the early stages, but we believe that there's an opportunity for us to have an $850,000 grant to help support that project. So right now for 2027, we have a suggestion of $100,000 to start design costs on that project, and then 2.9 million set aside in 2028 for construction. Next, we move into Washington site preparation. So one of the other things we've discussed in that area is a potential futsal court. And for that to happen, there's a couple steps that need to happen along the way. So first, we've got 125,000 here for the idea of surveying the lands, subdividing, and then adding in a sidewalk to provide access to that so that we can make sure that it's ADA accessible. A couple other things that we want to keep in mind with that potential Washington site preparation is we have the historic depot there, and if we want to take that depot to the next level and actually design and engineer it for some use to benefit the community, aside from being a historic structure, then we're going to need some design services to help us with that. And then we also have 25,000 we've just kind of put in there as a hold. As I mentioned, we're working on that RFQ, but if all of the expenses related to that don't occur in 2026 as intended, we want to make sure that we have some money set aside in 2027 so that we can meet our obligations to pay for it. As we continue through, we have our community park, which is moving along wonderfully. The northern finger, we have had a lot of progress on with the installation of the concrete pathways for walking paths and pedestrian paths. Also, the inclusion of 2 gazebos, and the native plantings are expected to be fully installed by November. So we're very excited, but there's still so many acres of that potential future community park site that are still undeveloped. So we did a plan several years ago, kind of 2022, 2023, where we got the initial round of community input. However, more recently, we've heard that the design that came out of that input period may not fully reflect what the community is looking for now. So to provide us the opportunity to check in with the community and update the design, for 2027, we've suggested $45,000 for a plan refresh to make sure that the version of the plan that we move forward with in the future aligns with what the community is looking for. This next item I have to be a little bit vague about because we don't want to put ourselves in a difficult negotiating position, but there are some opportunities that we're going to look into of strategic land acquisition. So sometimes there are properties that become available that may make sense for the city to purchase for city use, redevelopment, or shifting of ownership. So there are some that we're eyeing right now that were we to purchase them, it may allow us to reduce our CIP costs by about $1 million because we wouldn't have to invest the money that we're looking to invest in some of our facilities. So this is a very early concept, but it's something we want to get on the radar because we want to be open and transparent. And then for downtown modernization, y'all have probably seen that over the past couple of years, we've been trying to do a lot of work to really spruce up the downtown and bring in developers to show some interest in that space and get some investment. Some things we can do to help improve our odds with bringing in a good developer who can design a nice project for our community would be to do a topographic survey of city-owned properties along Main Street so that the developers have the information that they need. That will cost us about $100,000 to bring us closer to shovel readiness. And then phase 1 and phase 2 environmental assessment of city-owned property at $125,000. That allows us to reduce developer uncertainty, have them come in with confidence that this is the project that they want to do. We have a community that loves culture and art. So we're looking to set aside money for public art installations of $50,000. And then, of course, we've talked about the downtown modernization and beautification plan. And with that, we've gotten so much wonderful community input on that project. However, when we started that project, we were looking at about a $5 million expenditure. At this point, if we're to incorporate what we've received from community input, that's looking like it'll add another $2.3 to $5 million on the project. We're working on finalizing those numbers and firming them up a bit more, but this is the range that we have to work with now. Which means if these are things we want to do, we have to find a way to fund them. Some other requests that we've had come in are body cameras and fleet cameras for police. Now these have a grant that will help cover a good chunk of the costs. And then the records management system that the police department uses, there was one that cooperative was using. That one isn't really serving multiple police departments in this area at the level that they were looking for, which means they're in the process of trying to transition to a different records management system. In the long term, the cost will be mostly a swap out, but in a short term, it means that we'll probably have some overlap of the systems because it takes time to transition the data from one to another. So we're just kind of flagging that for you now. Also, if we're doing upgrades at the museum, we're looking to do some fixtures and furniture to allow better display of the museum items. Something that came up from our Downtown Revitalization Commission is the idea of form-based code, and that could be something that would make us more business and developer friendly along our Main Street to really draw in something that creates the aesthetic and the vibe that the community wants while reducing overall hurdles to development. And then our administration department is requesting fire safe cabinets so that we can keep our documents safe. All right, I'm going to take a short water break. And I believe as we're getting to revenue options, we will have some more items to talk about. Okay, so in past years, specifically last year, we talked about some new revenue options. And one of them was a home rule sales tax, and that was estimated to generate about $1.2 million. At just 0.25%, we would be able to generate a nice chunk towards accomplishing community initiatives and priorities. That rate increase on our home rule sales tax and our total sales tax impact on the community would put us higher than some peers, but there are also examples of places that would still be higher than us. It'll include items like luxury goods and also clothing. It will not apply to titled assets. One of the things that's important to recognize on the timeline as we're evaluating potential revenue options is that in order to start collecting in January 2027 to get to that 1.2 million, we would actually have to have it approved by council and then postmarked before October 1st so that it could be put in place in time to start collecting January 1st. If we miss that deadline, then we have to wait all the way till July to start collecting. The next item is the grocery tax, which is estimated to be about $438,000. Now, that would be us adding it back in after the community has gone 1 year without it. That was adopted by about 700 communities. It targets necessities like food, although SNAP recipients are exempted. And that also has that same postmark deadline of October 1st. To kind of talk through some of the rates, these are some other communities to get an idea of where their general merchandise rate is. And these were some that we were able to verify today, but there are absolutely more out there with more rates. So you can look at some places near us where there's some that are the 7.5, 7.75, but we also have quite a few that are in line with where we are currently at the 8.75%, such as the DuPage portion of Batavia, Glendale Heights, Downers Grove. And if we were to go with this 0.25% increase, we would be aligned with the Bartlett DuPage portion, Addison, and then there's also Lombard's Yorktown Business District, which is actually at 9.25%. So that gives kind of an idea of where the general merchandise sales taxes are in DuPage County. Some other considerations as we're talking about revenues would be a cannabis dispensary. Would the council and the community want to change our rules to allow a cannabis dispensary in West Chicago? That would ultimately be a policy decision. Based on analysis of other communities in our region of similar population size, we would estimate that if a cannabis dispensary actually located in West Chicago, that perhaps we could estimate getting about $200,000 a year. There is no guarantee, even if we update our code to allow a cannabis dispensary, that one would choose to locate in our area. There will be challenges related to potential public safety issues. There's also market saturation because many of our neighboring communities already have dispensaries. And then as a whole, cannabis revenue has kind of flatlined, even starting to decrease statewide. Another area that we can look at would be amusement taxes, also known as the streaming tax. So in an initial audit, we would be looking that if we were to implement a streaming tax at a level similar to our franchise fees with cable, we'd be getting maybe $50,000 to $55,000 a year. However, that would need to be evaluated in the context that we found that some of our other amusement fees are actually a bit higher than our peers. So it may make sense for us to go through a process of aligning those more consistent with the general market. One of the other items that's come up and that many of our peer communities do is a restaurant food and beverage tax. It's not something that we're recommending as it demands significant staff time. It could deter growth, and that doesn't really align with where we're trying to be in a high growth time frame. And it would be a higher administrative burden for some of our smaller businesses. So just something for us to have on the radar. And now our Business and Community Relations Director, Kelly Chrissy, is going to come up and present on just a couple of additional concepts.
You want me up there?
That would be wonderful.
Okay, so as we've been talking about kind of user-based fees with many of these revenue generating options. One of the things that we've been sort of thinking about is whether or not there would be some sustainable revenue sources for maintaining our roadways, most specifically our industrial roadways. So we have many land uses where the improvements on the property generate a significant amount of property tax. However, there are some uses which are all very valuable and contribute to the wonderful community that we have here that may not generate as much in terms of property tax revenue for us to be able to maintain the roads that typically those uses generate heavy traffic or heavy truck traffic as a result of. And so really what we're evaluating is a potential consideration would be a way to incorporate a user-based tax and or the potential for an increased motor fuel tax on diesel. Now, the city currently has a motor fuel tax that applies to both regular gasoline as well as diesel at the rate of 3 cents per gallon. So there is an option to increase the diesel motor fuel tax. Now, as we look at, again, sort of just an option, not necessarily a recommendation, but just a consideration here. If we were to increase the diesel motor fuel tax by 3 cents per gallon, that would yield, based on some somewhat limited data that we've collected so far from our existing fuelers, it would generate approximately $50,000 a year in revenue. Now, that would be specific for improvements back into the roadways. And again, it's sort of a dedicated source. Now, for the other option to consider in terms of outdoor storage and or commercial vehicle storage, things like that, this could be, there's kind of a variety of different ways that we can look at this, but this is one option to consider where that revenue generated from this tax could offset some of the revenues that were actually, I guess, generated when the city back in 2023. I can't find that date. But the city actually implemented a 0.5 sales tax increase to be able to generate revenue for infrastructure funding specifically. And so if we can implement a user-based tax on those uses that more heavily utilize our roadways, then there may be an opportunity to offset some of that so that the sort of originally stated purpose of using that sales tax increase can then go back into the general fund for other operational purposes. So there is one option to consider with the heavy truck traffic and roadway infrastructure. Then, as we look to next year for special events, we have somewhat of a unique circumstance where we have a challenge, but also an opportunity here. So with the construction of the downtown as a result of the Downtown Modernization and Beautification Project, we will actually have a challenge in terms of finding location for our special events, which normally take place in our downtown. What's great is that in 2028, we will actually have a really nice new experience for our downtown events to return to. But in the meantime, we are exploring options for ways that we can continue those activities and events in 2027. But we will have to get a little more creative with where those will be located and how we deliver those events and activities. And so one other thing that we've been doing as a result of that is we have actually hosted some discussions with our community partners to talk about ways to collaborate and to try and align our efforts with regard to not just events and activities, but also communication and other engagement opportunities. And so we're evaluating whether or not we could potentially create either co-hosted events that we share costs or reduce costs for individual organizations, and or seeing if as part of that, perhaps try and identify the most impactful events and see how we can better contribute to make them even more impactful and enjoyable for the community. Because as you see, one of the challenges that we have here is that we have a lot of really great events and activities in the community, but many of our organizations are concerned about the fact that there are so many events and activities that it may be diluting not only attendance, but also participation by the community and others attempting to take advantage of those. So by trying to increase collaboration and sharing resources, we may have an opportunity to not only strengthen our partnerships within the community, but also create more impactful events that perhaps we can minimize costs and staffing or coordination needs within each individual organization. So another option that could be considered would be to expand event generated revenue. So there's an opportunity here where just recently the city started exploring the use of sponsorships. So it hasn't really been a program that we've used well. And so this is an opportunity where perhaps we can start looking at some either expanded sponsorship opportunities and or looking at sharing opportunities where it could be multi-event sponsorships. It could also be sponsorships within the community where we're sharing sponsors amongst community partners, depending on what structure we decide to go with, if any. There's also the opportunity to perhaps have merchandise as part of our special events and be able to sell that merchandise to be able to generate some revenue that way. So there's, and looking at the vendor fees. In some instances, we may want to keep costs really low. In other cases, if it's a really popular event, there may be an opportunity to increase vendor fees to be able to generate, again, more revenue specific or event specific revenue. And then also the potential to evaluate whether a dedicated special event fund may be helpful so that when we do generate revenue and say, for example, the budget for an event, we spend less, then we could hold that over and be able to utilize that in future years to be able to reinvest in the events year after year. And then again, sponsorships and things like that could then potentially be held in that fund so that it's sort of a dedicated fund for that purpose. So I think those are all the slides I have.
Okay, well, thank you for being with us through this whole process. I want to say thank you to our Director of Business and Community Relations, Kelly Chrissy, and thank you very much to Jacob Henderson, our Interim Finance Director, for their presentations. So before we wrap up, I just want to provide an opportunity if there's any questions in the audience. I know I've posted in the chat a few minutes ago to see if we had any questions. So just kind of provide that last few moments in case anyone wants to have any questions or comments? Okay, well, thank you all for participating in this. I really appreciate it. And of course, come back and check in with us as we continue through this budget process. We have many more workshops to come, including on Wednesday, the 26th. We'll be talking about general fund and continuing some of the conversation that we've had here about special events.